Hello. How was everyone today? Okay. In Petaluma trying to find a coffee shop. Yeah. Jess and Barshan, welcome. Morgan, welcome. Okay. Yeah. All right, so why don't we get started? So I'm going to talk about our meetings first, and then I'm going to go over some things that Jesse and Morgan shared in the chat, and then we will go from there. So the first thing we talked about this week, or the first meeting that we had this week, was DevoWorm, and that was on Monday. And we had a little conversation before we got into the preview of the NetSci conference. So this is the NetSci conference for 2026 being held in Boston, sponsored by Entropy and Complexities journals. And they're, basically put the moments from the meeting on Blue Sky. So I haven't gone back to the feed. I think I reposted a couple of things from the conference, but I'll have to go back and look and see if there was anything really of note. So there were a number of interesting keynotes. Sturgatz and Watts gave a talk. Barabasi and Elbert gave a talk. These are, of course, the authors of two seminal papers that came out in the late 90s on network science. There's also a lot of workshops and symposia that were kind of adjacent to the conference, which are also very interesting, including network neuroscience and other sort of biologically oriented network sessions. So yeah, Watts and Sturgatz were there. They gave a talk in lieu of their prize that they got at the conference. These are, of course, two luminaries in network science. They kind of developed this idea of small world networks, working from social networks, data, and sort of existing theory that existed. If you go back to Stanley Milgram, he did an experiment where he sent a bunch of people letters and he told them to go post them to other people that they knew, and then eventually they were supposed to post them back to him. And this, it sounds like chainmail, the classic chainmail, except that he wanted to see how many hops it took people through their social connections network to get back to him. And it turns out that it actually doesn't take as many hops as you might predict. And it's because you have these hubs in the network that facilitate shortcuts through the network topology. So this is where the idea of small world networks kind of comes from. And then they kind of developed the mathematics of this. So, we had the intuition from experiments, and then sort of we got the mathematics worked out. Then, of course, we had Albert Laszlo Barabasi and Reka Albert, and they developed the idea of scale-free networks in 1999. So the Watson-Sturgatz paper was in 1998. This was in 1999, and they wrote a paper on scale-free networks and proposing what those are. Those are basically exist in a regime between random networks and small world networks, and also provide, sort of components of the topology that facilitate sort of this spontaneous order that we see in a lot of networks. And so this is, again, I think they were getting a prize here as well. And so then we went over the schedule, and we went over some of the side sessions, the workshops, the satellites, they call them. And, it was really interesting stuff. So And Jesse noted that this was being held in Boston, so that's where Jesse is. We had a little discussion about that. Then we talked about 2 papers on musculoskeletal coordination and learning. And in biology, we have musculoskeletal systems. They're part of a larger embodied sensorimotor nervous system. And so we talked about how that works. And then what they were doing in these papers is they were applying reinforcement learning techniques to simulate that system, especially sort of the fine-tuning of that system. And so that's what these papers were about. So this one was on using curriculum-based reinforcement learning to do these kind of musculoskeletal tasks. And they've developed kind of a methodology for extracting the sort of the principles from the musculoskeletal system using these learned synergies, boiling that down to neural dynamics, and then putting that into a set of policies that a neural network can learn from. And so the curriculum learning is, of course, the key component there. And we've talked about curriculum learning before, but you can use this, of course, in the absence of reinforcement learning. But I think a lot of the approaches use reinforcement learning as a way to sort of drive the curriculum forward. Okay, and then we also talked about this other. This is something else that Jesse brought up. This is stuff that we've, of course, talked about in the Saturday meetings from Avery Lim, and we're talking about affordances, I think, in that context. And then okay, this is the next paper here. This is on a model called Arnold. This is a generalist muscle transformer policy. So they were using transformers here, but they were also using reinforcement learning as well, and developing a model for the same thing. And so they were going through this. We went through this paper. So they use a different approach, but they're trying to do the same thing. And we basically compared and contrasted those 2 things, those 2 models. They have a musculoskeletal policy where you do some sort of task, and then their idea is they want to be able to transfer those tasks across, or transfer those skills across different tasks. So you have things like finger reaches, or manipulating balls in your hand, or manipulating dice in your hand. And those are tasks that require different muscle synergies or different muscle groups to be activated at different times. Then, of course, you can do that, but you need an embodiment. So this is the human embodiment, where you have a hand that manipulates things with fingers. And so you could do this with a different embodiment, but of course, it would be a very different set of behaviors that would be executed. Then you have the pen reorient, which is a different task altogether. And the idea was to just kind of see how you can transfer those skills from one task to another. And they show their behavior cloning, reinforcement learning, fine-tuning, and refinement steps here. So that was this paper. And so that was pretty much the meeting. I don't remember what we talked about at the very end, but I think we reflected on the 2 papers and how they connect together. And then we made this connection between motor learning, sensory motor coordination, and language learning and language production, which is, of course, they're connected things. When you're producing language, you're basically producing motor control, because you have to be able to say the words that you have in your head, and it requires an embodiment. But also it does use a number of parallel circuits. So I'll get into our second meeting that we had on Wednesday in a minute, but I wanted to go over this one from Friday, which was our open source meeting. So we have our open source meeting on Fridays, and Barshan started us off with a blog post on his work for the week for GSOC. He was working on a data set loader, so he was getting the data into his environment. And he was working the data set that, of course, has a formal structure, but the data that's available sometimes exists outside of that formal structure. So the idea is you need to build a data structure for the data to be interpretable. and that's what he was doing here. And so he's using PyTorch geometric, which of course is an existing toolbox in Python to do this, and it also helps you bring this into a machine learning context. It had some really interesting visualizations with respect to the lineage tree of C. elegans and creating these point clouds of different cell centroids that would accumulate as the cells divided and the embryo grows. So you see this, you have a few points here, and then you fill in a set of or a cloud of points that kind of looks like an embryo as it's developing. And I told Barshan that this is something that we've been doing for, we often do this for validation of data sets. So you want to see if it looks like what it's supposed to look like. And you're successful in your pre-processing efforts when you can replicate something like that. Now, we also do other things with these point clouds, but it's important to really have a point cloud to start with. Then he was talking about his plans for the future, and this other interesting thing that he mentioned was that he's kind of thinking post-transformer. He's reading this paper where they talk about this model called Mamba 3, which is something that goes beyond attention. It's better than attention in terms of performance. And this is something we talked about in this group, where what do these post-attention architectures look like, or what are the alternatives to attention? So attention, as we know it in machine learning, of course, is this mechanism that people have kind of, for a while, they thought this was the thing that was going to give us, great increases in performance. But when we're dealing with something like biological machine learning, or something like that, is attention really the best mechanism we can use? Okay, so we had some more visualizations. That was fun. And then Ashu gave us an update on her work. She was writing out the documentation for her project. This is on functional hyperedges in hypergraphs. So she's working on this and writing out the description, the docs, and then this is her open source repository where she has her code and her documentation and everything. So this is her work. So it looks good. We had some comments on things to edit, and then we had a little discussion about the role of documentation in your in your projects and how it's essential. Okay, and so then I think Jesse had a discussion about I can't remember what we talked about yesterday. We talked a little bit about what Kavya was interested in, which is this agent-based modeling and computational agents and how those go together. Jesse had some words to say about that, as well as how to sort of participate in the group and how to sort of start your own open source project. Then we talked about this repository on Hugging Face. So we haven't talked about Hugging Face too much in this group this year, but Hugging Face has a lot of resources that sometimes parallel GitHub. Sometimes they offer different things than GitHub. And in this case, there's the Society and Ethics group hosted on Hugging Face. So they're doing a lot of things with auditability and openness and other types of things that are involved in AI ethics. So this is basically, finding ways to improve models to make sure that they're doing what we want them to do and to make them conform to things like legal regimes and cultural expectations. And so that's kind of what this is all about. We of course had the Society Ethics and Tech group in this lab for, 6 or 7 years now. So we've been doing work on this. We might get involved in this, but it also gives us kind of some feedback on where to go next, maybe. So it's interesting. Then Morgan brought up this work on terminal bench, and Morgan is very interested in scientific reproducibility. And so that's what terminal bench is. It basically allows you to set up a workflow with AI agents that allows you to do replicable science. And so, this is where if you set up the workflow, you set up the, on any data set that you want to analyze, you can just run it and you can be assured that it'll basically give you the same results every time. And so this is what this terminal bench science is. It allows you to control things using AI agents and refined methods and things like that. Yeah, we went through that paper. We also went through this resource Harbor, which is an open source registry that does kind of a similar thing. It's just a quality control measure. It allows you. It's sort of it allows you to manage things like Kubernetes and Docker. All right. And then, Weight Watcher was, of course, another thing that Morgan brought up in this conversation. We've talked about Weight Watcher as sort of this auditing tool for deep neural networks to be able to kind of account for the weight matrices and be able to sort of benchmark and evaluate those. Okay, and then we just had a little bit more discussion, and then Jesse had a little preview of what he's going to talk about next week, which is this idea about how to speak and tell a story when you're a researcher or when you're trying to communicate an idea to people. So, there's this sort of method for presenting to people, or multiple competing methods to how to best present information to people. There's the substance first model and the hook first model, which is either where you grab attention or you earn attention with relevance or you grab attention with a device. And it's sort of to the preference of the author as to which one they use. But the idea is you want to be able to grab people's attention. And then, of course, there are these things that you can do within the talk to optimize the talk for your audience and for your own benefit. And then, this is again.
We didn't quite get into it, so I did like the shortest preview possible. But I think it was quite interesting. Like the slide you're on is something very much worth focusing on, and it's also basically directly what I call him my guy Larry, but Larry McInerney from the Expert Writing Chicago thing. Like that was basically his premise as well as that slide too. So to see it come up here repeated from sort of this old classic is like I do think like I retitled just before the actual presentation the opening slide to say vintage advice, and part of the thing about the vintage or not was like what's still applicable today because things change and trends evolve. I think this is stood the test of time, if you will. And I don't. It's not again an implication that people's ideas don't matter. It's just um, there's a particular skill set to making your ideas accessible to other people.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I think it's all about accessibility of ideas. And so there's the skill of having the ability to speak well about your idea as well as writing it. But, writing it, of course, I want to be able to see you kind of explain it outside of the strictures of a paper. So papers are usually pretty formal, and they don't give you the freedom to kind of explore things, but also make them maybe visually compelling, make connections that you might not do in a paper and so forth. So yeah, and then these are the people who have kind of give presentations on this. And then that was basically what we, we also, Jesse has some tips in the slide deck about how you might apply this to a demo of some type. So, this is demo or die type stuff. So this is where, you can be really efficient in your demo. And, really in demo or die, you need to be efficient. You need to be able to get right to the point of what you're demoing, how it relates to something larger, what the demo is supposed to do, and then, just kind of have one or two ideas to focus on as sort of a, maybe a big picture takeaway. So that's kind of interesting too. Maybe we can focus on the demo or die aspect too next time, because I think that's kind of, for our group, it's kind of the most important thing, I think.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to do, and the last slide is just the recap slide. I think what I'd like to do, and it's it's evolved since then. So I'll kind of carry on the conversation. Is I think I'm kind of imagining 3 or 4 parts in total. One I think is vintage advice, which I think is really good for young people to hear because if you're talking to certain generations, that's what moves them. Um, like the Connor, the second speaker who I kind of was like, oh, this is navigable. The things there are incredibly useful to know, and it's even more useful to know when you shouldn't and when you should lean into them. So that's sort of one thing at large. We get these questions about, oh, how do you blah 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 to the audience or whatever? How do you know when it's a mixed audience? Those things really come up. I think there's like also specifically there's very timeless things that you could be drilled down a bit more into, like some of the expert writing stuff, um, and also what Bradley's saying about principles of demo or die flash talks that prepare the art of preparing your minimum viable talk, like the smallest talk you can give that really gets at what you're saying. Because I think that's sort of the you can always add on and elaborate from there, but how do you get sort of it's sort of like the smallest, the smallest model you can make that isn't excessive, and learning how to do that in a talk form is a sort of the bedrock skill. I've been in my mind for over a year now. I'm trying to come up with this. It's a bit sports analogy heavy, um, but like, what are the like in football or American football, blocking and tackling is the sort of your fundamentals. Like we talk about, oh, go back to fundamentals. What are like fundamentals for interdisciplinary research or innovation in the places that we're looking at it? And I think essentially the flash talk and the demo and or die elements of that kind of get at it. So that I'm that's not a finished product yet. I know Bradley's does tons of things and teaching open source and project management and whatnot. So maybe a future thing to do there specifically. But the last thing I'll say before we move on to other things about the professional development topic is what is who what is the latest, like what is now, like if not the 11-year-old video on YouTube, not the old timers speaking their wisdom, which is a fine thing to do, but like what is it now? And I found a very good thing to address what that is, especially in the current moment where institutional clout, bureaucracy, and sort of the resting on there's a tremendous shift away from institutional. I'm associated with institutions, so you can listen to me, and very much focus on individual, sort of like founders versus bureaucracy. But what does that mean really in terms of communication, in terms of writing certain things, of styles, and of connecting, in particularly in I would say technical innovation spaces. And there's some folks that I've been watching for a while there, and I think one of the next things I'm going to talk about in GSOC, but also, frankly, in the data and direction program that's about to basically start next week. Um, I I really think that's a little bit of a classic Jesse, like, history part, key things, and then where we are, where we're going. It's very, I feel really good. I feel like we there's a solid curriculum that's developing here, and it feels complete in a way that I wanted it to feel complete. So to be continued on that next week.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you, Jesse. So that was all for this meeting. All right. And then our third thing I wanted to talk about was Wednesday. This was where our Cognition Futures reading group got back together. So if you go to the Joe Pro or the Just Parent YouTube channel, you'll find this Cognition Futures reading group session. And this was just a recording of the session with Jesse giving a little preamble at the beginning. So Jesse also posted one of his Substack posts on this. So it just talks about how we're getting this group back together after a while. We took a hiatus at the end of 2024. We had done so the lab has a kind of a long-standing interest in cybernetics, and we kind of worked on that for a while, off and on, and then we started integrating that with Cognition Futures. We did this reading group where we started with Norbert Wiener's book, The Human Use of Human. What was it? What was it?
Human use of human beings.
Yeah, The Human Use of Human Beings, where we went through chapter by chapter. Every session was like a single chapter, and we kind of reflected on the book at where things are now, basically. So that was a book that was written in the 1960s. Norbert Wiener's work was sort of mature at that point, so he had a lot of things to kind of reflect on from his own work, and then sort of apply those lessons to the development of technology, which might not seem relevant today, but it actually is quite relevant to today, in terms of kind of the themes that he's talking about, and then kind of the themes that technology critics are talking about today, or people who are just interested in sort of AI ethics more broadly. So this is, that was sort of the genesis for that phase of the cybernetics project. Then we also reviewed a few papers. And we had this group that was active for about a year and a half, just within Cognition Futures, on these cybernetic topics. And of course, that culminated in the paper that we just published, or just got published last month, on the Evergood regulator theorem and world models. And so that was a kind of a big gain for the lab, I think, to see that through that arc from reading group to paper.
It is interesting because I was so focused on the history of hold on, the history of where Cognition Futures stuff. It's just weird to think of the whole arc of 20. I think the origins of the reading group itself was 2022-ish, and I forget when our first recorded meeting was, 2022 or 2023, and then it was all the Varela on becoming aware of Hough.
Right.
And then yes, it kind of after that, or towards the end of a certain run of the Varelian lineage, we did this. The cybernetics element emerged as a center, and it was interesting because the On Human Use of Human Being is kind of a it's a society, ethics, and technology book, and we things weren't quite, so some things really carried well, and some things were oh, this is sort of a little strange way to talk about it, right? But then we went back into other parts of like cybernetics theory, and I think that's why if in the video, I don't know if it shows up in the abridged version that I clipped all the way. We met for like an hour or a little bit over that maybe, um, and I reduced to like 20 minutes, so it was like very 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 abridged. But even in there, you might see like one of the last things in the old Cognition Futures reading group. Notes are shared. Super lightweight note stock was Levin citing the 1943 kind of not step graph, but that organizational diagram of predict types of behaviors in one of Levin's own presentations. So it was interesting to kind of just see that again, and it was really great to see everybody to come back together. I kind of just I don't know what we'll quite call everything yet, but I'm really happy to have had getting the band back together. So I don't know if you or Morgan or anybody else wants to say more, but I'm just happy that it just happened, and curious what will go next.
Yeah, so I mean, I hadn't mentioned the Varela and the Fuchs stuff, but that was actually more Cognition Futures sort of slotted, and then we said, what are we going to do next after Fuchs? And then we did the human use of human beings. So that was nice. But yeah, I mean, this is, again, I like these reading groups because you can unpack things. You're not, like we do that in this meeting, we do a lot of features, we do a lot of catching up for the week. In these meetings, it's a lot more focused, but also unfocused on what we can do. So, what do we want to do for this meeting? It's just focus on chapter 1, discuss chapter 1, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, this I'm likening. I'm basically trying in my mind. This is my admin hat. I'm basically realizing what I want to hand some new folks, and maybe we should have done for Google Summer of Code, but for data and direction folks and other people coming in through Joe Code and other things that we're doing. I basically want to hand them a digital campus map, because I feel like in the like the working groups are almost like these sessions that are happening in specific classrooms, or if you will, or like specific arenas, like the Google Summer of Code, like the open source cohort stuff. You have DevoWorm, you have data and direction, you have DigiNest now, you have the Wednesday meeting, and it's like what's going where. This meeting is it's like a big jam session in some ways, and I've always appreciated the openness of it, and I think the openness of it comes with, and I've maybe done it enough this every season. I remember eventually, or like try to emphasize, and we want you guys to come in and say things too, like come in and have a presentation, like add your thing to the what's it, the stone soup, everybody brings their stuff and throws it in the pot kind of a deal. Like it doesn't have to be me talking or Morgan or Bradley. Like we really want to encourage folks to come and do that too. But yes, I think there's a lot of in-house or like neighbor directly adjacent to in-house things going on, and it's nice that they can kind of flow well into each other. A lot of good things come from that.
Yeah, I'd be interested in that roadmap, or the whatever you're calling it, the virtual campus. Because, well, we do give like people in the onboarding materials, we do give them sort of a map of the meetings, but it's kind of like, here's a list, or here's like a YouTube channel, which is useful for exploring, but like it doesn't give you a sort of an overview.
And yeah, and like this is, maybe we don't have to talk about this extensively right now, but in my like mega admin hat, and like program planning, and by program planning I specifically mean like the things you're doing, especially if there's a public-facing component that's not just doing research and reading papers directly, like hosting meetings, hosting sessions, project development, working, the means by which you could work on the project that isn't just at a regular standing meeting, like all that kind of stuff. Where I'm going with this is like, I've been starting to. I appreciate that Morgan's like, I gotta go find a coffee shop this morning, because that's often me here in Boston too, like, and that's sort of what Boston has become to me, like this broad Boston campus. Even though I'm not directly tied right now to one location, I go to coffee shops all the time. And I was really, I might mention this later, but I was disappointed as I've been a little bit under the weather, if you will. I wanted to go to an MIT AHA group had run a seminar, a screening of the AI doc, and a nice discussion about that. Like, there's a lot of cool stuff here locally, but there's a digital equivalent for that too, and everybody in the core of like this group and Devo and JoPro are like digital first, but it's like where, even giving them like a loose semblance of a map of like where are things, not just like, we've made those maps before of like, oh, well, where's NeuroMatch relative to ORL, or where's like DevoWorm, or where's like Cognition Futures, like those, like, that like thing with like 3 columns or something like that. That was like a couple, like 2 or 3 years ago now. It as an aside, nothing is stranger than being someone who is now fully transitioned from student who doesn't manage anything to the mental process of, oh yeah, we started that group a couple years ago. It's like 5 or 6 years ago, or 7 years now.
Yeah.
Or like, oh, that diagram from it's 2 or 3 years old. And not old in a bad way, just like, oh, like, it's so present in my mind, but you'd have to dig to find it now, But anyway, I think making not just like a map that's like nice and visual, but like a nice explanatory thing. So, 'cause a lot of folks in the like that I've been bringing in for data interaction are like, oh, this is great, and like, what else? And I'm kind of mentioning to them, hey, you're welcome to come to like this meeting, the Friday meetings, the DigiNest meetings, if it's spoken to them. But like, what is that? Like, what is that sort of? How do you visually represent what's kind of happening in that space to someone who's brand new? So I'm working on that, and maybe that'll be a little something I try to do this weekend and show off to some folks next week. But I'm happy to have feedback or input, particularly from Bradley about what should that even look like. So that could be, we can talk about that elsewhere. I'm sure we have other things to say, but I'll probably make something like that soon.
Okay. So yeah, let's see a little bit about this this post on Substack. So this is just kind of discussing why we're getting back together on this. And so yeah, these Cognition Futures reading groups have been very broad historically. We've talked about things like phenomenology, cybernetics, dynamical systems, complexity, and the philosophy of mind. And then, of course, we have this cybernetics discussion offshoot that led, of course, to the paper, and a lot of sort of jump-starting of our cybernetic interests in the lab, and putting out some papers. I did bring up the paper, I think last week in this meeting, we talked about the paper pyramid and how that, that's kind of an overarching plan. I don't know if that's relevant right now, but we can revisit that if Jesse's willing, and we'll. But this is something, of course, you should constantly reevaluate, anyways. In any case, we're kind of pulling back into this arc, and we're seeing what we can do and how it can go forward. So we had.
And if you want anything added or thrown in here additionally, you're welcome to do that. I'll probably also send this to Medium too.
Yeah, I think this is good, and you can send this to Medium, and we can just have this as the post. We can have future posts, I guess, as we get further into it.
This is basically more of a hyper abridged, I almost want to say showcase, because I was like, do I either try to present all of these like multitudinous strands and names? I put a lot of the names in the YouTube video description, just like kind of for like SEO type purposes, but also just because almost as a reminder, is like, hey, like we talked about like everybody from beer to Raja and from beer to Raja and back again, like that kind of a. But in here, I'm just like, well, I'm just gonna like make it as I'm gonna intentionally leave out a lot of stuff and just have this posted as almost a ceremonial. Hey, we had a first meeting. The band got back together again. I'm very happy that we did, and here's some related things.
Yeah. So we had Jesse, myself, Amanda Nelson, and Avery Lynn. So Amanda was in a lot of she was present in the Cognition Futures reading group back when we were doing it. Avery was sort of, kind of interacting with us, but not able to make the reading group meetings. So then we got some perspective on things, where maybe we should go next. We talked a little bit about Avery's work, and it was a nice meeting. So this again is like, we would like to sort of drive this forward. We've been revisiting this discussion group from CogSci 2021, which of course we hosted something called Trajectories in Cognitive Science. So the Cognitive Science Conference hosts these discussion groups where you can discuss a topic. And so we had like a series of talks on different topics in cognitive science. I think Jesse and a few people did a talk on developmental psychology. I did a talk on trajectories as a computational concept and how you can apply that to thinking about, different cultural and cognitive trajectories. And then I think Avery presented something, and we had some discussion around that. We should do something like that again if we can find the opportunity, or even if we have to make our own opportunity.
That's a dovetail on something I was going to mention. Like, I think I'll put it this way: both for like compilation of data and direction stuff, and because we can, I think something at the end of summer, like late summer, and when is yours? Because you are probably doing stuff in a teaching capacity or something, as usual. I would like to. We can pick the date later, but I think the next opportunity for a larger scale event, I would love to have like a, in East Coast time, there's in the West Coast, but like East Coast, it's before late April, is like, and sometimes early May is that time where like all the schools here in Boston have their the AHA symposium, the CERC year-end symposium where you have the thing and you have the informatics student showcase, like the thing for your department to show off your big stuff at the end of the year. I feel like there's a summer version of that is the next version of a lot of things, and it could be basically a big showcase for like what's the ecosystem we have doing. And I think we could do it. Like DigiNest, if this group comes up, that would be great. And it could just be Cognition Futures related, but I think there's enough to make it. You could have a small, especially the most wanted suspects in this room. Usually, if you give us each 20 minutes to talk about a particular set of projects, something like that, we'd have so much to say. So I mean, that's a little bit flippant comment, but there's a lot of opportunity for that. So maybe trying to plan an event at the end of summer would be fun, if that's a good time for people to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a good plan. Yeah, I know we've been trying to come up with an idea for a while for some sort of presentation, so I'd like to try to see that through this year.
Yeah, like even right now, like one I had wanted to in it. This is big time admin with a little bit of a jar pro lean here. I talked last year of like I want to do like there was I think something that took the place of this last year was the Augmentation Lab Summit or the Human Augmentation Lab Summit at MIT, which is fantastic. That's not going to happen this year because everybody was in that base. They moved out of town. A lot of them went to San Francisco, to be blunt. But there's other things going on here that are great too. And I had foreseeing some of that and foreseeing, I would say accurately, that 2026 was going to be a very strange year on many fronts for many people and many things in the world. I'm like, okay, let's do something. Let's make a certain event. This basically might be a version of that event, okay? And at this event, I would love to basically tease a launch of the actual GeoPro Future Center. I'd love to have Google Summer of Code folks. Not everybody's, most Google Summer of Code will be probably done in a way by them or something, but a way to kind of reference what happened. And by that, I mean everybody in the open source cohort. Speaking of, I had a few people reach out about some of the multi-agent whatever stuff. Talk about that later. But like Google Summer of Code, DigiNest will have things to say. Cognition Futures might have things to say. The GeoPro Future Center might be a cool thing to say. There's also potentially an opportunity to have a sort of semi-artistic component too. I'm still talking to like Ecolopto, Addy, and at least one person who I think is local, interested in doing sort of an art. Basically, I'm keeping the theme of like art. He's been saying jam session a lot more recently, but it's like jazz jam session plus interdisciplinary research communication. A lot of there'd be a way to talk about that. So I'm kind of imagining the program of like these are kind of programs and the people in like this thrust that we have currently, a couple of free sessions, and I don't know. I think there's enough there to make it some kind of I don't know what to call it, but some big festival of the larger RL community and GeoPro stuff. I don't know, but I think there's enough there to do something at that time, and I'm happy to make it. It could be an hour long thing. It could easily be in 90 or 20 minutes, and it could basically be like a whole half day, like 4 hours. It could probably be like 7 or 8 hours of stuff. But I don't know that any of you guys would want to do that much. But like, I think this could be a solid chunk of multiple hours of activity that would be substantial. We haven't done anything like that. We didn't really do anything like that. I don't think last year. So I mean, I'm not saying we could just repurpose last year's stuff, but I think there's just a lot that could happen there.
Yeah, I think we did the open house in like 22, 23 in that time period, or maybe
that was
24.
Well recorded. For context, for anybody who's not in this room, as we all know, I think the open house was a wonderful thing, in part because Bradley did a thorough job and really got many like bigger nexus or nodes in the lab space and the community, and also smaller ones. So it was a very nice sort of inventory. And we've done some other like recap type things since then, but not as thorough, perhaps.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that was like served a purpose that was different than this, but I mean, the idea of recapping this space, kind of how do you make the most of like the getting things out of your head, making a description, fitting things together, discussing them. I think it's pretty nice. Yeah, it's very A life in the sense that you want to have an artistic component, and then the science component, and then they're different. It's bringing together a lot of different things, which I like.
I'm least sure about the artistic component, but just to make it more, that seems to be like the in vogue thing to do.
To invite an artist in, yeah. Well, like
totally dunk. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
A-Life, they have like an artist, like usually someone who applies A-Life principles to their work. In this case, it could be someone who's doing some sort of cognitive science oriented art. It's just kind of within the theme. So yeah, people have done that pretty effectively, I think.
Yeah, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it outside of the meeting.
Yeah,
I'm actually, I can already put myself. The only thing that I would have to work around would be some other like programs or summer things that I've been doing. But I think August and the end of August or whatever would be sometime in August or probably before September gets up would be a great time to do it. I will pause myself because I'm gonna just keep planning it right now. We can talk about other things.
So the next thing I want to talk about, this is something Morgan posted in the Slack. This was in Data Science or Data Science ML or Data Sci ML. And this is from SakanaAI. So we were talking about benchmarks in the open source meeting. And he posted this from SakanaAI, which is where they have this recursive self-improvement lab, or RSI lab. And SakanaAI is doing things with like artificial life with genetic algorithms and applying it to AI research. So that's they're based in Japan, so they're kind of working in that community as opposed to say like Silicon Valley. So this is what they call the next paradigm of artificial intelligence. So as the world enters the era of AI, Japan has a unique opportunity to reclaim its position at the frontier of global innovation. However, to achieve global leadership in AI and scientific discovery, we cannot simply stick to the conventional approach of brute force monolithic models. We must leapfrog the current paradigm. History shows us how Japan's historical dominance in manufacturing was not achieved through abundant natural resources, but by fundamentally redesigning the institution of the factory floor. Through the philosophy of continuous compounding self-improvement, Japan created systems that achieve more with less. So they actually, this is one of the things that Japanese companies often did in the 80s and the 70s through the 90s, was they had the Kaizen method, which is basically stands for change, improvement, good, or that's what it translates into in English. And it's basically a early form of agile. And so, they were using those kind of techniques on the factory floor before people were using agile in the tech industry. And so this is kind of where they're kind of thinking about it in terms of that, but also applying it directly to an AI pipeline, say, as opposed to managing a team developing AI. So to achieve this at SakanaAI, we are building open-ended adaptive architectures that collectively self-improve. Just as biological evolution innovates endlessly by building upon past discoveries, our AI systems must transition from being static tools to autonomous researchers. So they're using this recursive self-improvement technology, and they're applying it to foundation models. And so this is the research group that they're announcing here. So they're kind of going through the history of the group. So the history of the group was that it was founded in Tokyo in 2023. In 2024, they published the first version of their AI scientist white paper. They then released this large language model squared model, which was I think something in collaboration with Disco Pop in the UK. Then in 2025, they released AI Scientist version 2. They had the Darwin Gödel machine paper in collaboration with UBC in April of 2025. They then published this white paper on the ALE agent or ALE agent in collaboration with AI Coder AHC 058. Then they had this AI Scientist article in Nature, so it was published in Nature in March of 2026. Then they also had these other things, one in August 2025, Shinka Evolve, and then in February 2026, the Digital Red Queen. So they've been working on these different projects that are kind of connected into like the evolutionary computation space, the artificial life space, and applying it to AI. So this is kind of thinking about what they're doing. I like this diagram, by the way, Jesse, because this is kind of what we were talking about with respect to how do we plot out our progress, how do we communicate that to people in the group. So, you could take this, we could have something similar to this for orthogonal. We could link different, milestones to papers or to blog posts or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah. So then they have a bunch of different, they describe these different research milestones here. And then kind of thinking about the evolutionary optimization loop as the universal sort of unit of what all these things have in common. This is their sort of proprietary sauce here. And so what unites this is an evolutionary optimization loop that has defined SakanaAI from inception. Progress through ideas, not just compute. And so this is just kind of talking about the advantage that gives them. In the Shinka Evolve paper, it required only 150 samples to solve problems that brute force search treats as intractable. So it gives you an advantage in terms of training data and in terms of performance. ALE agent outperformed 804 human heuristic specialists by extracting structured lessons from its own failures, not by burning more inference. The same conviction will shape our pursuit of RSI. We are building not the most compute-hungry self-improvement engine, but the most sample-efficient one. And so this has relevance to these type of foundation models. They want to develop agentic foundation models, and thinking about agent-native models that power an AI scientist, and then how that AI scientist in turn can build better agent-native models. So basically, you have agent models that are building or that are contributing to this AI scientist, and then the AI scientist gets revised constantly. So this is a graph that that they show for this. You have cycles of research and development and self-improvement. So this is like the prototyping cycle where you keep building prototypes and you keep improving based on feedback. And that's kind of how they view this, but in this broader context. And then scientific discovery capabilities. So as you keep improving your model, you keep improving your discovery capabilities, and this is exponential apparently. So you have these agent-native models, which are based on a large language model and a world model. You have the AI scientist, which is involved in automated discovery. And then you see this recursive self-improvement where the AI optimizes AI code. And then this is democratized AI, sovereign AI for all. It's very much one of these startup sort of blue sky type graphs where you show like the benefit of your approach over sort of the status quo or over everyone else. We don't have the details of how this actually works, but this is sort of the vision. So that's the idea behind this. So it's sort of this building off this idea of self-improvement and applying it to the AI ecosystem.
Kind of like view of things. And yeah, I checked in with them for a while, you know. So was just thinking about this summer's A-Life combined meeting. It seems to be happening in Waterloo.
Yeah.
And yeah, you know, there's these kinds of self-improvement loops. You know, everybody's talking about this right now because you know, Anthropic are making claims that make them money that that they've reached the point where their AI tools are self-improving. Their AI tools.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, yeah, I'll put some things in chat.
All right. Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, that was a good article. I enjoyed taking a look at that, and we've been following SakanaAI for a while, and so yeah, I think that's great. Definitely integrating a lot of this self improvement into the actual development of the AI system. So I mean, this is something that we do anyways in development, but it's like thinking about how you're kind of versioning your models too. Like we think about how you want to release something that's like incredible, and you have these really big companies that are releasing like these, and you see this in big science too, where you have like big name labs and they release these papers that are like these blockbuster papers, and they have mass amounts of data, and it almost seems like they're trying to like overpower everyone else. So like the large AI companies will do this with their models, but at the end of the day, what we're interested in is like improving performance, because of course that's what's happening. So having a model where that's built in, I think is good.
Yeah, I hopefully you can hear this. Yes, many times these companies are just presenting with great grandeur and hyperbole.
Right.
They are making huge amounts of money from it.
Right. Yeah.
But Sakana has always been a very reasonable researcher.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because at the same time, like their AI science work is not. I still haven't seen a breakthrough on that. Gemini, the Gemini team pushing a new one currently.
Right.
The big thing now is to say that you have it, but that you get on a wait list.
Right.
So you can evaluate it.
Yeah. So it's like you have, of course, you can have these major breakthroughs, or you can just say you have a continuous improvement of the model. And which one is more honest, I guess?
This is it, right? Is that like that this is where the research world has merged with the business world.
Yeah.
Where it's just like making outrageous claims is actually very helpful for your valuation.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So like this is super problematic, where it's like DeepMind has great teams, but don't make it about tools that nobody can check or evaluate.
Right.
like when you're ready, yeah, call it a business tool, but don't call it a science tool until it's really.
Yeah, I think that's well. Thank you for that, bringing that to our attention. Okay. So I don't, Jesse, did you have a more extensive discussion that you wanted to do today, or?
Ooh, I think I'm actually going to say no for once, and if only because I think my mind is on both some of the campus map, digital campus map that we mentioned before, as well as that event that we talked about. In terms of things that I'll just note that are coming for the week ahead, one, data interaction should be starting, it is starting now. And I know this sounds like the conventional thing you're supposed to say, kind of the glad handing and we have great students and whatnot, but it's I think maybe more authentic ways to address that is it is genuinely humbling to see folks want to do stuff in this space. We've had great people apply, and I'm looking forward to starting this year with them. I'm very looking forward as well to the Cognition Futures group. Things with the Avery Indigenous are emerging as well. I got to find out when, because there's sort of an event in Boston. I think it's in mid-July. So there may be a smaller JoPro event in person when Molly and some other folks are in town for that. But I think the major event will be August, somewhere in August. That's where things are now. I do want to follow up on the professional development, like speaking and demoing. Speaking conventionally, speaking in a more modern sense, demo or die, and some of the fundamentals. I think those are things that will come up over the summer for many folks. I have things in the docket for that. And the only other thing on the radar is the biggest wild card for the summer for me is if I get into DISI, the Diverse Intelligence Summer Institute proper or not. I don't expect it. I said, hey, yeah, I'll go in, to it. Mm-hmm. If I do get it, or if there's something that opens up. It's interesting because it's in New York, upstate New York of all places, and not Europe, St. Andrews, United Kingdom type stuff. But outside of that, I won't drone on about anything else right now. So it's about the win for everybody.
That's good. No, thank you. Looks like Barshan is here. Did Barshan want to give an update about anything or talk about anything? Let me go through the comments here. We had some things in the chat. So we started here with Jesse said hashtag alternatives. Then he said it might be a good to review Hugging Face overall, maybe in the GSOC meeting ahead. Yeah, I should go over the DevoWorm Hugging Face because we did put that together in 2023, and it has actually all of the pieces of software that are part of the DevoLearn platform. So Barshan was asking about that yesterday, and he wasn't so familiar with DevoLearn as opposed to DevoGraph, and I want to go over that. And then between Weight Watcher, Arnold, and the back to the 80s presentation. Oh, the one I did for embodied intelligence. We might need to make another throwback plus computation related topic. Yeah, that's something interesting, isn't it? Yeah, kind of if you're exploring a certain topic that's kind of modern, where does that come from? Or something like that. If you're not familiar with the presentation I gave for embodied intelligence, it was basically isolating the sort of the foundations of embodied intelligence models and agent models and artificial life models that sort of percolated in the mid to late 80s and early 90s. So there were a bunch of themes. One of them, of course, was Bradenberg's work that culminated in the Bradenberg Vehicles book in 1984. There was, of course, Boyd's, which was Reynolds' work. There was other work around like swarm intelligence and passive dynamic walking, and all those things kind of came together at that time and then influenced later embodied intelligence. So that was like well received at the conference, and it's on our YouTube channel. I think it's a nice historical sort of overview of that, but plus, kind of linking that to the modern era. Yeah, I think that might be good. I'll have to think about what that looks like, though. Yeah, and this is also part of the cybernetics group too, right? Like cybernetics, our interest in cybernetics is twofold. One is technical, but the other is sort of this historical aspect. So what is it about cybernetics that we can kind of bring into the present? What is it about the history of cybernetics that's kind of relevant to what's going on today, and getting that out there for people? Yeah, so that's good. Yeah, and then Barshan stumbled upon this link here. So Barshan stumbled across this work. This is from ETH Zurich. This is from the Soft Robotics Lab there. And it's called the ORCA Hand, Open Source Dexterity at Your Fingertips. So this is following up from the stuff we were talking about in DevoWorm on Monday with musculoskeletal groups and simulating that using reinforcement learning. This is, of course, talking about robot dexterity, or, you can use this also for sort of human prosthetics and control mechanisms for that. So ORCA is a reliable, cost-effective robotic hand that combines human-level dexterity with open-source accessibility. With plug-and-play design, tactile sensors, and zero-shot learning support, ORCA accelerates manipulation research for all. And manipulation research is where they're designing hands that can manipulate different objects. And, of course, engage in skill transfer so that you don't have to retrain the hand for every single dexterity movement that you make. So, we kind of learn if we sort of use a pen versus have some dice in our hand and shake them and throw them on the table, or we use a computer mouse. We do have to learn how to use those things, but it's very minimal in terms of the training. I mean, we have all sorts of different types of cognitive shortcuts. So there are affordances in the objects. There's just encoding, which is where you basically interact with something and you can kind of figure out how it works. And that's based on previous experience and the like. So we want to make this more human-like in terms of learning and training. So general purpose robots should possess human-like dexterity and agility to perform tasks with the same versatility as us. A human-like form factor further enables the use of vast data sets of human-hand interactions. The primary bottleneck in dexterous manipulation lies not only in software, but arguably even more in hardware. So the bottleneck isn't really about the software so much. They're arguing the bottleneck is the hardware. So this is kind of, we were thinking about this on Monday, where we have this aspect of the software and kind of how that skill transfer has to work and how we can design sort of a reinforcement learning paradigm or maybe a curriculum learning paradigm to help us enable that. But also, we didn't even talk about the hardware. What is it about the hardware that enables this kind of learning? And of course, they just kind of talked about, simulating muscle groups, but building it in a robot, it's far different. You need to have the proper feedback in the mechanism. You need to have compliant materials for the muscle and the surface of the robot's skin and all of that. So if you go to the Embodied Intelligence conference, there's this whole, focus on sort of soft materials, soft active materials, where they're basically considering what are the best materials to make a robot body out of. And that's key to the cognitive question. So, robotic hands that approach human capabilities are often prohibitively expensive, bulky, or require enterprise level maintenance, limiting their accessibility for broader research and practical applications. So, what if the research community could get started with reliable, dexterous hands within a day? And this is just kind of making this easy and open source and everything for people to use in different settings. We present the open source ORCA Hand, a reliable and anthropomorphic 17 degree of freedom tendon driven robotic hand with integrated tactile sensors, fully assembled in less than 8 hours, and built for a material cost below 2,000 franc or 2,000 CHF. We showcase ORCA's key design features such as popping joints, auto calibration, and tensioning systems that significantly reduce complexity while increasing reliability, accuracy, and robustness. And so they benchmark the ORCA Hand across a variety of tasks, ranging from teleoperation to imitation learning to zero-shot sim to real reinforcement learning. So this is a picture of ORCA version 1. This is where you have tactile sensors on the fingertips, popping joints at the joints, and these are things that provide feedback and flexibility or compliance respectively. And you have the silicone skin, which is again for compliance, so you don't want to have something that's harsh when you're trying to grip something. You want something that gives and then but still provides that feedback. And then of course to have a wrist with enough degrees of freedom to make movements that reach for different things. And you can, when you're manipulating something, you move your wrist, you move your joints, and that gives you a lot of degrees of freedom for exploration. And then, of course, you have to build with an artificial hand. You need to build the hardware, the sort of the actuation, and then the cooling fans, which are important in a mechanistic hand as well. So this is kind of showing their design. And this is version 1, which is, this is all sort of separate from the actual computational algorithm. This is how they're designing the system. They don't have any sort of muscle mechanism in here other than the actuators. So that's, kind of what we were talking about in the papers on the musculoskeletal systems. Those kind of are just thinking about the muscle groups first, or the muscular control first. And they don't even consider the actual mechanism of the actuation. But in this case, they're thinking about the actuation and not thinking about sort of any analogy to muscle. So they think when you start doing the sort of simulating muscle in a physical form, it becomes expensive to do, at least nowadays. Maybe in the future it'll be different, but so this is mimicking the human hand and just kind of, mimicking that as being the sort of the gold standard for manipulation of objects. Of course, we talked about, which, of course, you can compare that to the octopus, where they have a very different system of manipulation of objects in the environment. And so, you could look at that as well. But in this case, they're just looking at the human hand. So just food for thought. And then they're manipulating this Rubik's Cube. And this person is wearing a prosthetic device over their hand. They're trying to, do pose estimation for the hand movements involved in a Rubik's Cube. And then grip, so they're closing their fist. Oh, go ahead, Barshan.
Oh, yeah. So I just found it interesting that it was the first time I saw something in the hardware aspect or domain is open source. So yeah, it removes a lot of testing and stuff. Thank you. if in the future they try to use that, you know, can be open, and open source community can be open in the hardware area also.
Yeah, it's, there's a lot of open hardware, but the benefit of open hardware, of course, is similar to open source software in that you can, usually you try to make it very simple for people to replicate it, right? You give them the parts, you might give them something they can 3D print, or something very easy to get materials, and then you give them the plans and they can build their own thing. But then the benefit of that is you can benchmark it in all sorts of different environments or in all different contexts, use cases. And then ideally you would have a way to get feedback from those groups. Like people will set up discussion boards and they'll say, okay, if you use this open source protocol or open hardware protocol, what's your experience with it? How can we improve it? Can we create issues that are improvements upon the design? And if you have a bunch of people using it in different ways, you can solicit potentially a lot of issues and address those and then improve it a lot faster than if you had to do all that testing yourself and then release like the perfect version, where you had to actually go through and evaluate it and then come up with suggestions for the next version. Those sorts of things. So yeah, this is good. Thank you. Yeah, these are the kinds of projects that neurotech students work with. Yeah, definitely kind of looks like a research/student project type thing, where you could do like, here's a piece of hardware. Can you replicate this? Can you build this and implement it? Yeah, people are using EMG as sort of the control. So you send EMG signals into the hand, and you have to decode the EMG signal so you know which signals are kind of doing what, and then you map that to the device. We talked about this paper, I think it was last time, and we kind of went through this abstract. And I know this is something Barshan was interested in, so I wanted to talk about it a little bit more. This is this paper on the developmental visual diet. So this is where they use the human visual system, development in the human visual system, as an inspiration for guiding curriculum learning and training of the model. So this is where they go through and talk about how we can use this sort of approach to improve machine learning models. So they talk about kind of the benefits of how humans learn how to evaluate visual information, and then how AI currently does it, and that there's this gap. So to close the gap, you can take inspiration from human vision, how that develops from early infancy into adulthood. And so they quantified visual maturation by synthesizing decades of research into a novel developmental visual diet for AI vision. So we didn't really get into the figures of this paper, but we can get into them now. So this is their figure 1. And so the text here, following the developmental trajectory of visual acuity, chromatic sensitivity, and contrast sensitivity from newborn to 25 years old as an effective means of training robust AI vision systems. So basically they're looking at 2 components of visual acuity, chromatic sensitivity and contrast sensitivity, and they're evaluating this from newborns to 25-year-olds and then using that knowledge to build their model. So the first thing they have is they have an image data set. They're using EcoSet from ImageNet, and they're using that they're pre-processing those data, and looks like for a standard artificial neural network processing, the network that you're training is always at a mature state. So all you're doing is you're deriving weight matrices in the network, but the network is always at the same level of maturity, meaning it doesn't develop in any way. It doesn't tune itself in a developmental sense. And what that means in terms of an analogy is kind of cagey, because That could mean a lot of things. I mean, we take weight matrices from the notion of neuroplasticity, basically where synaptic connections get tuned to certain stimuli, to certain information. And that's basically how weight matrices emerge, is through sort of getting experience with a data set and then having a statistical description of that data set embedded in those weights. But of course, that's not what happens in development. What happens in development is you start from a state of very low maturity and you move to a state of high maturity. And they're using the example of human development, which is, of course, where a lot of the maturation happens maybe before age 10. And then there's this maybe contextual maturity as you age up to 25 years old. So it's very much, instead of a linear function, which is flat and it's always mature, you get this logarithmic function where there's a lot of maturity early on and then refinement later. So that's for pre-processing. And for artificial neural network training, they use a number of different candidate network approaches and models. And then for this robust vision test, the battery involves looking at shape texture bias, abstract shape recognition, degradation robustness, and adversarial robustness. So of course they're looking at the ability to recognize shapes in different backgrounds, looking at the difference between shape and texture, and then, what happens when you degrade an image. Is the model robust enough to recognize the object in the image despite it being degraded or warped in some way? Or if you have two examples that are very similar or two identical images that have different labels, can the model distinguish between them? So that's basically what they're doing here. And then they have figures B through E, and those are where we're looking at the developmental trajectories of the three aspects of vision modeled by DVD, which are visual acuity, contrast sensitivity, chromatic sensitivity, and then those are B through D. And then this is synthesized from a multitude of psychophysical experiments across age groups. So this is just kind of reviewing the figure B and C, reviewing the literature. The first one is where we're looking at Snellen visual acuity, so it's a certain measure of visual acuity. And there's this parameter within that measure called the blurring sigma, and that blurring sigma increases with sort of at a very early age, like within a few months, it saturates down to 0. And so you have, you start off not being able to see very much. And then by the, age of like 3 or 4 months, you're able to see at pretty good visual acuity. And then it just drops almost to near 0 visual acuity, meaning you can detect very fine-grained objects at about maybe 25 to 30 months, maybe 40 months. So this is all in infancy, basically. And then, as you get toddlers, you get up to the age of what a toddler is. And so these are the different studies that have looked at this. So most of the studies have focused on this period where you're gaining visual acuity. And then they've run some studies where that visual acuity is saturated. And they just show the different references here. And there's this fitted developmental trajectory. So from all those studies, we can get a sense of what this function should look like. For contrast sensitivity, there's this frequency magnitude threshold. So we're looking at contrast instead of visual acuity. And again, we have all these studies that show kind of what these look like over a period of months in development, from 0 to 300 months. And we have all the studies here, and we can derive this function, which is sort of a S-shaped curve. So it's a logistic function, and we can use that again for our training regimen. And then we have chromatic sensitivity and the component of color fidelity, and this is where they're sort of looking at this one study, Knobloch et al. 2001, and they look at average chromatic sensitivity as a function of the protan, deutan, and triton axes. So this is just kind of averaging that out. And that's what they use for their model. So E shows kind of how what these images look like. So if you combine all of these things, remember we said visual acuity is very weak at 1 month, but then it gets refined as we get towards 300 months. So we have 1 month, which is where everything is really blurry, and in our model everything is really blurry as well. In 4 months, things start to clear up. 16 months, they clear up even more. 64 months, and then 256 months, things are very sharp. And so that is how they kind of go through this. They, kind of model this refinement of ability to see very small feature sizes, and this is how this works. So to model the continuous development of human vision, we reviewed the existing psychophysical evidence and how human vision develops from newborns to 25 years of age, and synthesized the developmental trajectories of 3 core dimensions of physical maturation. So visual acuity, chromatic sensitivity, and contrast sensitivity. So this is all in this pre-processing pipeline for AI vision. Across the series of experiments, we demonstrate that guiding AI through this human developmental visual diet, instead of the gold standard of high-resolution AI vision training, is an effective means towards approaching human-like robustness in visual inference. Deep neural networks trained with DVD exhibit shape bias beyond the state-of-the-art, greater reliance on spatial integration of visual features, increased capability of abstract shape recognition, and heightened resilience to image degradations and adversarial attacks. So this approach helps to build on, sort of the robustness and the performance of the model in ways that the state-of-the-art pipeline does not. Importantly, the translation of human psychophysical data into an efficient image preprocessing pipeline for AI necessarily involves selecting a level of abstraction that balances replication detail with algorithmic considerations that will enable easy adoption in the field. Due to the many remaining differences with biological vision, DVD is thus not to be considered a veridical mirror of the perceptual world of infants. So this is not, this is not actually what happens in development. This is like what we know from the data and what we're kind of extracting from the data. So that means it's kind of a rough model of what's actually happening in infants. But we know that if we can take those broad principles and apply it to this developmental visual diet, or DVD, and use that as sort of a guide, we can get the benefits of biological image processing in humans. So they have a number of things here in this figure 2. This is models trained with DVD close the gap to human level shape bias. So these are the different types of stimuli they tested the model on. They have these cue conflicting stimuli. So they have an airplane and an elephant, a bear and a clock, a bicycle and an elephant, a bird and a clock, and they're just these conflicting stimuli. And they train it on that. And then they have the shape bias accuracy trade-off. So they see that the shape bias accuracy trade-off increases with maturity. So shape bias increases as you get exposure to more shapes, as you become familiar with more shapes. So when you're 4 to 6 years old, you're not as locked into certain shapes being a certain thing. It could be a number of different things. And then as you move to adulthood, you sort of gain this bias. But you also gain accuracy in encoding that shape. So that's kind of what these dotted lines are. Then you have this dotted line, which is the performance of the model. And they're testing this on mini eco set accuracy versus shape bias. So as the shape bias decreases, the accuracy increases, which is this kind of, so the baseline here, and then this is the DVD performance. In this case, in this graph, you have eco set accuracy versus shape bias. And again, you have these DVD models here. As the accuracy increases, the shape bias decreases. Then you have the shape bias benchmark, which is for all these different models. And they look at supervised models, SSL models, multimodal models, the DVD models, and then humans. So they can look at human performance versus all these different models. And then, of course, the DVD models for shape bias. And so we can see that, like in humans, there's a high level of shape bias. In the DVD models, you have a high to moderate level of shape bias. For the multimodal models, you have a little bit less shape bias. And then for the supervised models and SSL models, they have a low to moderate amount of shape bias. So the shape bias is lesser in some of these supervised models and greater in the multimodal models, the DVD models, and then, of course, the human models, which are, of course, in development, you have 4 to 6 years old, 7 to 9 years old, 10 to 12 years old, 13 to 15 years old, and then the adult. And so the adult, you have a lot less variation, and it's a high, almost bias of 1.0. So you get like a tightening of the bias over age. With the DVD models, you also see this tightening over age. I guess the ResNet 50 eco set DVD-P versus DVD-B, and then ResNet 50 eco set DVD-S. So DVD-S has the highest level of bias amongst the DVD models. So they're comparable more or less with the multimodal models that they've tested. So it's interesting how the multimodal models and these developmental visual diet models have a higher level of bias and they're closer to what humans are doing than the supervised models. And so their results are basically that, you can successfully map from sort of human development to these kind of models and see a performance difference between that and some of the other types of machine learning models. DVD training promotes near human levels of shape bias. So a defining feature of human visual perception is that when presented with object images for which the texture and shape information are in conflict, observers reliably report perceiving the object category in line with the shape information. So this is where you have the shape bias that allows for people to sort of disambiguate objects. And so if you can do that, that's helpful because you have access to the label. It's also not helpful if something is a certain shape, but it's actually not that thing. So we make category errors like that all the time. But in general, this helps us to recognize things from incomplete information or get the gist of what an object is and then just kind of correctly categorize it. So there's a lot of flexibility in human cognition in that sense. But it also sometimes leads to us misclassifying things. So this is, I would say a problem in human cognition because quite frankly, it's more robust than maybe an artificial model. So that's kind of what we see in humans. This bias increases in development as we saw in the graphs. In 4-year-olds, we have a shape bias of 0.9. In adults, a shape bias of 0.96. By contrast, DNNs irrespective of network architecture, it's deep neural networks, irrespective of network architecture, training set, data set size, or training objective, exhibit a strong tendency towards texture-based decisions. So their shape bias scores typically fall within the 0.2 to 0.4 range. So they're much lower level of bias. And so the way in which DNNs usually work is they focus on texture-based decision-making, texture-based features. The texture preference in deep neural networks therefore constitute a signature difference to human vision. So this is kind of the difference here, and what they're trying to do is exploit a different type of criterion for feature recognition and feature selection. Okay, so we explored the effect of developmental visual diets on the shape texture bias in artificial neural networks by performing a comprehensive hyperparameter sweep of developmental visual diet based on the ResNet 50 model. So this is trained on smaller scale image data sets, which was called mini ecoset, which is 280,000 images, observing a trade-off between shape selectivity and accuracy across hyperparameter settings. 3 representative model configurations were chosen for subsequent analysis. These are the DVD-S, which is shape bias favored, DVD-P, which is increased shape bias from baseline, and then DVD-B, not DVD-P, but DVD-B, which is shape bias with a modest accuracy loss of approximately 4.9% compared with gold standard training with high resolution images. So DVD-S stands for shape bias, DVD-P stands for recognition performance favored, and then DVD-B is where we have a balance between the two. So DVD-S is shape bias, P is performance favored, and then DVD-B sits in the middle. Crucially, when scaling these 3 variants to full ecoset dataset training, so instead of using this subset of images of 280,000 images, they use the entire set of 1.5 million images with 565 basic level categories. The prior results were closely reproduced. So they were able to reproduce the results they got on this mini data set on the entire data set. But crucially, when scaling these 3 variants to full ecoset training, the prior results were closely reproduced while the control model achieved a shape bias of 0.34 at 63% accuracy. DVD-S delivered a shape bias of 0.9. That is within the human range. And DVD-P exhibited a shape bias of 0.7, alongside a slight accuracy increase compared from the baseline. So 63% versus 65%. And DVD-B delivered a shape bias of 0.8, close to the human range, at a marginal 4.3% accuracy decline over baseline. Thus, this developmental visual diet training provided an increase in shape selectivity, and differs. DVD-P was 106%, DVD-B was 141%, and DVD-S was 165% over our gold standard baseline with high resolution training. So a category-specific depiction of shape bias for DVD-P, the ResNet 50 baseline in human observers is provided as a supplement, where they show, I'm not getting into the supplementary figures, which you can look that up for yourself, where they show examples of shape texture behavior for DVD, and then compare that with ResNet 50, and then ChatGPT 4.0. So importantly, the shape bias observed in our DVD-trained ResNet 50 model not only outperforms the corresponding control models by a large margin, so the control models are the other models that they used, but by also all other contemporary ANN models tested, setting the state-of-the-art in shape selectivity and closing the gap to the human range of shape selectivity. These included standard supervised convolutional neural networks, or CNNs, vision transformers, or VITs, self-supervised models, and multimodal vision language models, or VLMs, which we saw in that graph with the different models and their performance. Note that these models include DNNs trained on orders of magnitude more data, as well as models operating on orders of magnitude more model parameters, highlighting the effectiveness of DVD training in shrinking down the number of parameters we have to deal with, as well as the data set size for training. And this is one of the things about these developmental approaches, is the promise is that we don't need to use as much training data. We can just take a smaller training data set and somehow extract enough information out of that to build good build good recognition models. So in development, we know that babies don't need that much information to make proper classifications, for example. We want to be able to replicate that in our models, but computational models so far have required massive amounts of data. And then, if you go back to this whole debate in cognitive science between sort of the statistical models and the symbolic models, the argument for statistical models was that basically, if you just train your model with enough data, you can really build something akin to artificial general intelligence. Whereas the symbolic people always argued that you needed heavily symbolic systems to accomplish that. And then, of course, we've had people, the neurosymbolic people, who have argued that we need a mix of these two things. And missing from that sort of that classification scheme are developmental people, who you might say, or might argue that you don't need that much training data to achieve human level performance, given that you have a framework that mimics human development. So their results, and then they have some other figures in here where they show the evolving shape bias over developmental time. So their DVD models will, exhibit this increase in accuracy over time, as opposed to the baseline models. So the baseline models don't change, their accuracy remains constant, but the developmental models start with a lower level of accuracy and then jump up to a greater accuracy over time. And then they have this this controlled rearing graph, which is basically where they can control the input data, and the DVDB model performs better on shape bias than the baseline or some of these, they have an array of DVDB models here where they show the different attributes. So in controlled rearing, the baseline model, DVDB model, has the highest level of shape bias. And then you look at visual acuity plus contrast, contrast only, color plus contrast. And then that is a much higher shape bias than if we look at visual acuity plus color, visual acuity only, or color only. So you need to have contrast cues in addition to visual acuity, or you need to have the model in its entirety to get that level of shape bias. So color does not seem to be a component of shape bias, it does contribute to shape bias, but it doesn't contribute to shape bias on its own, nor does visual acuity contribute to it on its own. You need to have contrast in the model, or all three factors in the model together. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. This is feature attribution, but I think a lot of the subsequent figures just kind of support this basic idea. We had a couple of comments in the chat here. This is Jesse's comment. Unrelated question for Morgan about Frontier Tower. Is there anything like that, or any partnerships with the Boston area, like MIT or any of those groups? I may reach out to Frontier Tower in general around partnership opportunities. Curious if you have any thoughts on that. I can follow up elsewhere. So I don't know. Well, first of all, if anyone has any questions about the paper, go for it. Otherwise, if Morgan wants to respond to that comment, he can. He said, not Frontier Tower, but Boss Lab in the Biopunk Lab.
Yeah, it's Frontier Tower is kind of somewhat unique, and I don't think they're looking for a spot in Boston, at this time. But Boss Lab is the kind of equivalent, is the community biolab in Boston. And you definitely do events with them. There's a nice network of labs associated with the MIT How to Grow Almost Anything introduction to synthetic biology. Yeah. Actually, I'll drop a link. David Kahn gave a really nice TED talk like less than a year ago. That I didn't really recognize how closely aligned their vision is with biopunk and kind of distributed distributed arrays of labs. Yeah, hope that's helpful.
Yeah. So did we have any other commentary on the development of visual diet paper?
Well, sorry, I should have said, yeah, I mean, I was originally a cognitive development person.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I love this work. Super interesting. I like people, attaching GoPros to babies.
Yeah.
And sorry, I was just thinking about the, Amanda had suggested the Randall Beer paper, like what is that, like dynamical systems is applied to CogSci or something like that. Anyway, just makes me think of the Indiana, Linda Smith.
Yeah.
Group. Anyway, like being applied to cognitive development as well, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, really nice, great extensions of that kind of work.
Yeah, I think it's pretty good. It's pretty rigorous work. I mean, they went to the literature, they found all of the sort of the data, they fit a curve to the data, and they developed this technique that is both consistent with how we train, models, and how it might be, mimic human development. So it basically has these stages where you have sort of this acquisition, and then you have the development of the feature or development of the trait that starts with kind of a general sort of way to do it, and then it refines that ability over time.
Yeah. The last reading group we did was the last month's was the Distill Pub circuits, I think, thread, and it was very much visual system comparisons with neural network training, but this is the much more realistic, like how do those naturally develop? that's is awesome. Yeah.
I did want to get a little bit into this paper. I think I can probably get through in 15 minutes. This is a recent paper in Artificial Life. This is thinking about embodied collective cognition systems. So again, these are like agents that are doing collective behaviors, and they're embodied. And it's called System 0, 1, 2, 3. And some of the System 1, System 2 types of cognition that's in the cognitive science literature, you kind of know what this means. Let's go through, this is from a Japanese group, I think based at Kyoto University, University of Tokyo. And yeah, so they're kind of taking, again, like Sakana, they're taking a perspective that's a little bit different than the, sort of the Silicon Valley / MIT, Stanford school of thinking about this. So let's go through the abstract. So the article introduces the System 0, 1, 2, 3 framework as an extension of dual process theory, employing a quad process model of cognition. So dual process theory is where you have two types of thinking. So you have like the basic type of thinking, and then you have the reflective type of thinking. That sort of hierarchy. Ron Sun developed dual process theory for cognitive architectures. So this is also another place where this is coming from. So they're developing this system for different levels of thinking in an agent. So they're employing this quad process model of cognition, meaning there are 4 levels of thinking in terms of cognition. So expanding upon System 1, which is fast intuitive thinking, and System 2, which is slow deliberative thinking. So this is the System 1 and System 2 distinction made by Kahneman, where you have the system that allows you to make fast judgments, it's intuitive, and then you have the slower system, which is deliberate thinking or reflective thinking. But they're also building 2 more levels onto that. So the first additional level is where, like, it's a System 0, which represents precognitive embodied processes. So it's like what's happening with the body. We know that there's a lot happening in the sensors in the skin, sensors in the muscle, that gets processed up to the brain. That's all that sort of System 0. So you have to have a body. The body's taking information from different directions. It's being integrated in the peripheral nervous system before it goes to the central nervous system. So that's System 0. There's also, we know that there's this pre-filtering function within the peripheral nervous system. So not all information gets represented in System 1 even. It gets pre-filtered and gets presented to System 1 in a certain way that then System 1 can operate on it. And then, of course, System 2 will take that information as well. So we have System 0, which is this embodied specific level. We have System 1, which is this fast intuitive thinking. And then System 2, which is slow deliberative thinking. And then System 3, which is, of course, encompasses collective intelligence and symbol emergence. So it's this level above deliberative thinking, reflective thinking, which is where agents are collectively doing things. So we've talked about, first of all, we've talked about the emergence of collective behaviors, which is not something that is, additive from individuals. It's more of something that emerges from their interactions, but also from this concept of stigmergy. We talked about this, I think, on Monday in the DevoWorm meeting, which is where you have this, where you might have environmental cues that get deposited by individuals. They could be maps, they could be signs, they could be pheromones that guide the rest of the people or the rest of the organisms in the collective to a certain outcome. So this is the Systems 3 thinking. Okay, so we have System 0, 1, 2, and 3. We contextualize this model with Bergson's philosophy by adopting multi-scale time theory to unify the diverse temporal dynamics of cognition. System 0 emphasizes morphological computation and passive dynamics, illustrating how physical embodiment enables adaptive behavior without explicit neural processing. Systems 1 and 2 are explained from a constructive perspective, incorporating neurodynamical and artificial intelligence viewpoints. In System 3, we introduce collective predictive coding to explain how societal level adaptation and symbolic emergence operate over extended timescales. This comprehensive framework ranges from rapid embodied reactions to slow evolving collective intelligence. So this is not only a difference in sort of level of processing, but it's a temporal difference. So the lower levels are faster, they happen at a more rapid pace, and then the higher levels build upon that, and they can draw from a sort of a long series of events. So systems 0 and 1 have a long series of events that they're exposed to. Systems 2 and 3 can sample from that and produce an outcome. So systems 1 and 2 are explained, okay. In system 3, we introduce collective predictive coding to explain how societal level adaptation and symbol emergence operated over extended timescales. This comprehensive framework ranges from rapid embodied reactions to slow evolving collective intelligence, offering unified perspective on cognition across multiple timescales, levels of abstraction, and forms of human intelligence. The System 0, 1, 2, 3 model provides a novel theoretic foundation for understanding the interplay between adaptive and cognitive processes, thereby opening new avenues for research in cognitive science, AI, robotics, and collective intelligence. So this is, something that's kind of similar to what we're doing with metabrain models, and kind of similar to this notion of sort of continual learning, where you have this, we have this sort of learning as a time series, or learning from a time series, and then building upon those events. And sometimes that sequence is not linear. So, you have sort of exposure to an environment that's continuous, and some component of the agent is sampling from that, and then, acting upon that, but it's not necessarily linear. It's not necessarily completely sampled. And there's all sorts of interesting dynamics going on there. So I think this gives us a framework for thinking about sort of the hierarchy of processing, but also thinking about continual learning. So, they talk about System 1 and System 2. They cite Kahneman and Bengio, talk about this in human cognition and in AI, respectively. And so, they talk about the System 1 and System 2 models, which have sort of a limited application. So why do we want to add levels? And that's because the System 1, System 2 dichotomy focuses primarily on internal cognitive processes, overlooking embodiment and sensorimotor interactions with the environment. They do not account for collective intelligence, in which language and symbol systems evolve dynamically within human societies. They lack a broader temporal hierarchy, failing to capture how cognitive processes unfold across multiple timescales, from rapid reflexive reactions to the slow evolution of societal knowledge. And so then these limitations become more pronounced as we try to interact more with the real world. So if we're building embodied AI systems, we see the problems with this simple dichotomy, and we need to add more levels to get this sort of a better integration with the world, better continual learning. So a lot of times robots fail to adapt to real-world behavior because their cognitive models often fail to integrate fast, reactive motor control with slow, deliberative planning. Moreover, AI and robotics face challenges in modifying the languages they use for communication and in contributing to the cultural and societal formation necessary for collective survival. Their cognitive models often fail to manage long-term collective semiotic dynamics, that is, symbol emergence, hindering their ability to flexibly adapt to language and symbolic systems in the context of their environment. So they talk about the System 0, 1, 2, 3 framework, This framework is inspired by Bergson's philosophy of time, which provides a theoretical foundation for understanding how cognition operates at multiple temporal scales, from super fast embodied reactions to super slow collective intelligence. So I like how they frame sort of the embodied reactions to collective intelligence in terms of time. I think that's good. Especially thinking about those time scales and the differences between them and how those interactions tend to happen. Then they bring up the free energy principle. So inside the brain, we have the free energy principle and how this gives us a model for how biological systems remain adaptive. However, cognition is not limited to processes within an individual brain. And so they have very heavy emphasis on semiotics here. So in semiotics, it is widely recognized that symbol systems have arbitrariness, meaning that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is not fixed and evolves across communities and time periods. We emphasize this arbitrariness to highlight the core argument of this article, the existence of super slow dynamics in human or collective intelligence. Human societies continually update shared symbol systems, that is, systems of signs and their relationship with phenomena over time through social interactions. This arbitrariness allows adaptive flexibility and semiotic communication. Humans utilize a semiotic plasticity, analogous to neuroplasticity in the brain but not identical to it, to engage in intelligent activities no single individual can achieve alone. And this is what they refer to as System 3. So yeah, then they kind of talk about how you have all sorts of different types of adaptive behaviors without neural learning. They bring up passive dynamic walkers as an example of this. These examples illustrate how body-environment interactions contribute to flexible, robust, and intelligent behavior generation. And then they kind of contrast what they're doing with foundation models and multimodal large language models. And so robotics foundation models focus primarily on computational data processing and neglect embodied interactions. So this is why they're proposing this System 0, 1, 2, 3 model as sort of a robotics foundation model. And then they talk about richer hierarchical timescale or MTS understandings of cognitive systems. We aim to establish a reciprocal dialogue between Bergson's theories of memory, the emergence of consciousness, discussions of cognitive systems and intelligence. We attempt to extend Bergson's MTS framework, which is this richer hierarchical multi-timescale framework, by examining both its similarities and differences to contemporary cognitive models. So, and then of course their System 3 is rooted in the collective predictive coding hypothesis introduced by Taniguchi in 2024. And so that's how they develop their System 3, but they basically want to extend Systems 1/2 into this quad process model. Okay. Yeah, so that's basically the idea, and it really kind of goes over a lot of this and reviews it. Thinking about fast and slow and neurodynamical systems. So, again, we're dealing with fast systems 0 and 1, slower systems 2 and 3. And then, so their approaches were inspired by the dynamical systems theory for autonomous agent behavior, emphasizing the tight coupling between the agent's internal dynamics and the external dynamics of its environment. So this is where they quote Randall Beer, some of his earlier work from the 90s. This original dynamical systems approach, which may correspond to Systems 0 and 1, explain an agent's lower level or reflexive behavior in response to environmental changes through the concept of entrainment into attractors. So they talk about this tight coupling, which is, of course, a closed-loop feedback system, and that closed-loop feedback system is tightly coupled. So if we think about like sensorimotor embodiment, we can think about like the body as being tightly coupled to the environment relative to maybe like symbol production or reflexiveness in terms of like, what am I thinking? And so this tight coupling is, as you know, it has a very strong connection with this shorter time scale. Because if you have a longer time scale, you have too many things that can intervene in that tight coupling, and that feedback loop, or the efficacy of that feedback loop breaks down. So we're all familiar with the sort of the tight sensorimotor coupling that you see with, say, like an agent that's interacting with, say, its environment, where maybe it's trying to walk or it's trying to move an object, and it gets constant feedback from the environment, and it's basically trying to match what's in the environment. So that's system 0 and 1. And so it's very easy to model that. We know how to do that. But then we also have, of course, these levels 2 and 3, or these systems 2 and 3. So this is where we need to add in an internal model to this. So we have the internal dynamics and the external dynamics of the environment characterized by this tightly coupled closed-loop feedback system. But then we also have this internal model, which is where this is something as classic in robotics. This was developed first by Wolpert in 1995, where they have a forward model and they have a reverse model. So they have the forward model, which is sort of the predictive model, and the reverse model, which is sort of the model that produces the behavior. So they go back to Wolpert's work in 1995 on forward internal models, which correspond with the so-called world models used in recent model-based reinforcement learning frameworks. So we didn't, in our paper, and in fact in that whole special issue, they didn't talk anything about sort of internal models or forward and reverse models that they use in robotics. I don't agree that it's necessarily the same as what people are talking about now as world models. So we have the Hahn-Schmidt-Huber work and the Hafner work, which is, of course, where people are talking about world models. This is kind of an earlier iteration of this work. Basically, it's the idea that, you know, if you have a robot that's doing some sort of sensorimotor operation, that it's not just a tightly connected or a tightly integrated closed-loop feedback. It's actually where you have resources, like symbolic resources, that you can draw from to generate behavior. So this is, you know, a little bit more advanced or a little bit higher level than the closed-loop feedback, but I wouldn't say that it's kind of the same thing as world models. It's very similar, but not really. And so, but early work on robotic navigation problems demonstrated that the topological structure of the task space can be embedded as multiple attractors in an RNN by learning sensorimotor experiences. So that's that's sort of the idea that you have this dynamical system where you have closed loop feedback as a very immediate thing, and then you have this dynamical system that unfolds that the agent has access to through these attractor basins. So it can interpret the sort of the outcomes of these dynamical systems interactions as these attractors. And so then they just talk about how continuous sensorimotor experiences with minimal constraints can lead to higher order behaviors. Tani proposed hierarchical RNN models such as RNNs with parametric bias and multiple timescale RNNs to introduce a temporal hierarchy whereby the lower level exhibits a high temporal resolution, which may correspond to the system 1, and the higher levels exhibit a lower temporal resolution, which may correspond to a system 2. So this can all be fit into a model of neural dynamics, where different levels of different neural dynamics, and then we can map those two together. The mutual interaction between the top-down predictive and bottom-up recognition processes can be understood as the RNN implementation of predictive coding. And here they cite Rao and Ballard from 1999. So they have this predictive coding aspect to this. So I guess you're kind of matching the two different timescales through predictive coding. And so people have tried this with different things such as object manipulation, imitation, language acquisition, and social interaction. And so there's this RNNPB, which is, of course, this approach by Tani, which is the RNN with parametric bias. And then there's this MTRNN, which is the multiple timescale RNN. And there are differences here between these two types of models. RNNPB focuses on different frequencies of neural dynamics and its updates to the system, whereas the MTRNN incorporates multiple timescales by assigning different time constraints to each network level. At a higher level, larger time constants produce slower neural dynamics, whereas at a lower level, small time constants lead to faster dynamics. And so this is just kind of thinking about these different levels and how they contribute to sort of an integrated neural system that operates at different time scales that allow you to build these primitives, say in the sensorimotor control, that would be like a bring function, a grasp function, a reach function, and a release function. And then at the higher level, you're combining those into sequences of movements. And so that's how this works. You start with this sort of tightly controlled closed loop feedback, you build primitives from those, and then you combine those together. And they're all happening at different time scales. Okay, so that's enough on that paper, I think. That's a nice paper where they're introducing a lot of concepts and bringing them together and comparing this with world models. Although I think that would be interesting. They should have written a paper for the special issue because I think they're kind of unpacking this in the context of the world models of Hahn, Schmidt, Huber, and Hafner would be quite interesting. But yeah, this is, again, thinking about multi-scale cognition, thinking about these time scales of continuous learning. All right, did we have any comments or questions on that?
No comments, but I appreciate going through the paper. I was reminded of, I think that was one of the final group discussions, like Bergson and time and physical memory and where's memory located and how is it stored. Like those are things from ye old reading groups of past that it's good to see here again today. I'll mention this to Amanda. I don't think Amanda's going to be able to come to these meetings, but yeah, what I might try to do is sort of, because we're doing more with YouTube and things are somewhat easier to clip now, I might try to just, I don't know, find a way so that if someone wants to follow some of the conversation, they can do that. Like you're doing a good job of clipping things yourself and whatnot, but I feel like I'm ever torn between trying to organize things and realizing that that's impossible. So we'll see where it lands. But no, thank you for going through that. And I don't know if maybe Wednesday we can briefly mention that as well, because I think there's enough there. We'll see.
Yeah.
But that's all.
Good. Thank you. All right, so I think that's it for today. Have a good week, and see you next week.
Right.
Bye.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.